Welcome back to Filmmaking for Noobs. I'm Kyle Lawrence, and today we are dissecting a short film, the entire process from start to finish, seeing what we can learn from a zero-budget short film, and hopefully something here will help you with your next project. So we're going to be looking at and dissecting the entire process of creating a short film that I directed back in November of 2020 called Blue. This episode is definitely a little bit different than what I've been doing so far for this season of Filmmaking for Noobs. We'll get back on course to our next steps in walking through the entire filmmaking process, start to finish, but I thought that this would be a really good opportunity just to kind of show the entire process of creating a really low budget short film, all condensed into a single episode. But at the end of this episode, I will also include a complete visual effects breakdown for the VFX that were involved in Blue. As a prerequisite for this episode, you should definitely have already seen the short film Blue. If you haven't seen it yet, it is on my YouTube channel, so pause right now, go find it on my YouTube channel. I'll put a link to Blue in the description of this video as well. Go watch it, and then come back, and then we can continue on. Okay, so hopefully at this point you have seen Blue. We're going to dive right into it. I'm going to take you through the entire process from start to finish, concept to release, of what that looked like when I was creating Blue. And hopefully through this, you will maybe learn something that can apply to your next project as well. Blue was definitely a very unique project for me because the last few projects that I did before Blue, the ones that I directed, they were all, had a pretty decent sized budget. They had a really good sized crew, maybe 50 or 60 or so people involved in each of those projects. However, in November of 2020, for an assortment of reasons, I had really challenged myself and pushed myself to create another short film. However, I was not going to spend any money on it, and I also had a deadline of December. There was something I wanted to submit it to that was happening in December, so I had just over a month. At that point, I really had no concepts or even ideas floating around in my mind, and I took this entire project from newborn concept to completion and release in 30 days. November 4th, 2020 is the day that I decided to create this project. At that point, I had zero ideas whatsoever. So when coming up with the idea and knowing that I also had a very short deadline, I gave myself the following parameters to work within. 1, this could only take place in a location that I already had access to. 2, I was not going to spend any money on it. 3, I wanted to include some sort of really cool special effects, makeup, or prosthetic. 4, I wanted to include a handful of visual effects. 5, I wasn't going to audition any actors for this project, meaning I could only use actors that I already knew. 6, I was just going to do this with a small crew of myself and a couple friends. I would DP it, and I would only use equipment that I already own. And 7, scratch number 2, I'm going to spend maybe $1,000 on visual effects and prosthetic, but nothing else. I won't go into the details of writing the script, but needless to say, I came up with the concept, the idea. I wrote the script within a few days of originally deciding to make a film. I then shared that first draft with a friend named Mateo, who gave me some feedback, and then I went and adjusted the script based on that feedback and had my final draft within only a few days of having decided to make a short film. The script was about 5 pages long, and I knew that the film would be about 9 to 10 minutes in length. So now we're going to really dive into the production process and dissect just how this all came together, and hopefully you'll maybe be inspired or learn a thing or two from this. First, I set the film inside a small house. I live in a small house, so the location was already handled. Second, I created only 2 characters, a kid, our main character, and his alien-looking friend, who's also around his age. A few months ago, I directed a film called No Internet, which is going to be premiering at a few festivals this fall, and then will also be released online later this fall. So I definitely encourage you to check out the trailer, which I've put a link to in the description of this video. Anyway, 2 of the main characters who were in the film No Internet, Jarrett and Miles, were the 2 that I ended up offering these 2 roles to in the short film Blue. I didn't even audition them, and I wrote the parts to fit them, and I knew that they had the potential to execute these really emotionally challenging scenes and characters, so I created characters that would push them and challenge them, and I was not disappointed. And they both nailed it better than I even hoped for. In fact, their performances were award-winning, literally. Third, as much as I was trying to keep this cheap and simple, there were 2 other locations that I required. An exterior location, just somewhere out in nature where we'd see a few different sub-locations, and a hospital. The exterior location was pretty simple. There's a marsh not far from my house. I knew that I could keep the scenes simple, and I could film them with just myself, the actor, and a camera. I made sure that there was no dialogue in the exterior scenes so that I didn't have to worry about sound. So I checked that location off my list. Then a hospital room. Now, especially with no budget, I knew I wasn't able to get a real hospital room, and I knew I wasn't able to rent a location which films would typically turn into a hospital room, but I wrote a short hospital room scene into my script, challenging myself to pull it off in my own house. I'll admit that I did spend a little bit of money on the hospital room set. I bought a used IV pole on Marketplace for $50. I called up a hospital bed rental company and rented a hospital bed for 1 week. With delivery and pickup, all in was a little over $300. I borrowed some medical equipment and a bag of saline from a friend who is an EMT, so no cost there. I pulled together a couple pieces of my own furniture and some knickknacks for the set dressing. I borrowed a number 14 jersey from Miles, one of the actors. I mounted a computer monitor to my wall using an old mount that I had laying around. I connected my MacBook to it and I downloaded a little heart monitor animation to play on it. And I ordered myself a nice, lovely bouquet of flowers from one of those online flower ordering places and had it delivered straight to my door. I felt very loved when it arrived. That is how I put together a hospital room in my house. When I was first developing the concept for this film, I had recently come across this really cool like space-themed visual effects pack, which really inspired me as far as the visual effects goes for this film, that I thought it'd be really cool to have some sort of space-themed type stuff in this project. So that's what I did. So I made one character an alien, and that's where things like the other planet and space objects we see came from. In order to help me come up with this concept and create the whole thing really quickly in a very short timeline, before I even created the film, I hopped onto artlist.io, which is a really great music licensing place, and I started browsing through all of their music and looking for anything that had any sort of interstellar vibes to it so that I could put together a bit of a playlist that would really inspire me as far as this like weird out there space theme kind of fantasy world. And so I ended up creating a playlist. Some of the music from that playlist I planned on using in the film and did use in the film. And some of the music from that playlist I literally just had playing on set while we were getting prepped for each scene in order to help the actors and all the crew to just really kind of get into the right mood and to really, you know, kind of be in the right place, because there were some really heavy emotional scenes and the music I think really helped, I guess, bring the actors to that place. So at this point I had my actors, my locations, and my music. I recruited 2 friends to help me, and I knew that we could all just kind of divvy up the task and do everything ourselves. The plan was we used only equipment that I already owned, including my trusty 5D Mark II, which is already 10 years old, and a number of really old cheap lights that I have. Though I did borrow a really nice Sigma Art 20mm and a couple filters from a friend. Before we could begin shooting, my one missing piece was a makeup artist. I had reached out to a special effects makeup artist that I worked with before, and she was not available. So she referred me to a friend of hers who had some pretty awesome work on her Instagram. So I reached out to her, met her at Starbucks to talk about the idea and plans. I gave her a little money to cover the cost of supplies and materials, and she molded her own prosthetics and created this amazing blue alien look. We filmed on 2 Saturdays. The hospital bed arrived a couple days before our first shoot day. I set up the hospital set, and on Saturday, November 21st, 2 weeks after the conception of this idea, we filmed with both actors and no makeup. We started with the hospital set on one side of my house, and then on the other side of my house, we filmed only a few shots of Jarrett in which we were looking toward Jarrett and not seeing the rest of my house, which could not be seen at the moment because there was a hospital on the other side of the room. Miles was there and did act with Jarrett, but we never saw him in these shots since he was not in makeup. Having the actor there, though, did make it much easier for the other actor to get into character and deliver a truly emotional moment. A couple days later, the hospital bed was picked up, and I never actually mentioned to the bed rental company that I was using this hospital bed for a film, so they probably just assumed that, you know, whoever was coming home from the hospital only lasted a few days, and now I no longer required a bed. So, yeah, poor guy. The following Saturday, November 28th, we started the day in the exterior environment with only Jarrett. Then we moved back to my house where the hospital was no more, and the entire house had been dressed by me earlier that week for our creepy house set. While the makeup artist was applying makeup to Miles in one room, we filmed quite a few shots to cover the first page of the script where we only see Jarrett. After a 3-hour makeup application, we brought Miles out and we shot his side of the conversation. We then shot a couple shots which required both actors to tie them together. This was not a simple 2-person sit down and have a conversation type of film. There were quite a few shots. However, everything went really smoothly because I spent a whole lot of time during those couple of weeks leading up to the shoot day writing out shot listing, planning every moment. I created an extensive shot list ahead of time. I referenced the shot list on each of the 2 shoot days to make sure that I hadn't forgotten anything. Essentially, I had already edited the film in my mind before we began shooting. I think that on the second day of shooting, I may have added one additional shot as a, hey, that'd be kind of cool to do kind of moment, but everything else was pre-planned and thought out ahead of time before we even got to the shoot day. There were a few scenes in this film, but the entirety of the creepy house set was all one scene. Our final shot of day 2 was one apple, meaning we had 26 different setups just in scene 1. And yes, that number is correct because there's 26 letters in the alphabet minus 2 for I and O because we don't use those since they look like 1 and 0, plus the extra master and the apple. That's 26. 26 setups. That's a lot. Each and every visual effect which was seen in this short film was planned and budgeted ahead of time. This includes any thinking that went into figuring out how to pull off without being too expensive. Once I had my shot list, I determined which shots would require visual effects. I sent that shortened list of visual effects to my usual visual effects artist, described each shot to him, sent him the full script for reference, and asked him to provide a quote for each shot. Because my usual visual effects artist is a really amazing visual effects artist, the quote was somewhere in the ballpark of around $125 to $150 on average per VFX shot. I limited myself to only 6 shots, which he would do, plus there were a couple visual effects shots which I did myself. VFX Shot 1. Jarrett looks out the window to see mayhem. Wind, debris, a total storm of chaos with no distinguishable form. For this, we shot this at night, and we hung a piece of black outside the window. And yes, that is grammatically correct. A piece of black refers to usually a large piece of black cloth. You would think it's called a large piece of black cloth, but we just say it's a piece of black. I knew this would be a handheld shot with some movement in it, so the budget for this shot included building the 3D asset, comping them into the shot, and motion tracking. There was a little bit of rotoscoping required, however I did intentionally choose my camera angle in such a way that would minimize the amount of roto required. VFX Shot 2. We are now outside of the window looking in at Jarrett. We obviously use sound effects to our advantage as well. It doesn't quite have the same effect without the sound. This shot required the same 3D assets and 3D environment, with debris passing by in the foreground, as there is nothing to key or roto since all of the elements were in front of the subject. VFX Shot 3. We see a little bit of the storm and debris outside the small window on the top of the door. We put green screen outside to achieve this shot. It required a chroma key and more of the same 3D assets from the first 2 shots, along with motion tracking, but a much simpler shot to achieve and no rotoscoping. VFX Shot 4. Jarrett opens the door to reveal a different, friendly exterior environment. This obviously could not have been real because my small house is mere feet away from a large concrete wall. So we also achieved this by putting green screen outside of the door. When Jarrett opened the door, the green was keyed out and replaced with a plate shot of the exterior environment. The green screen was simply just a piece of green fabric. We borrowed some nice green fabric from a friend of mine who's a grip. We hung the fabric on the concrete wall outside my front door. If you haven't worked with green screen before, it's very important to think about what you're replacing the green screen with. Those environments don't just magically appear. You have to either create a 3D environment, or you have to shoot a plate shot, or purchase some kind of stock footage or environment. The plate shot in this case was just simply an empty environment of the exterior location that we were using. VFX Shot 5. Jarrett is now standing outside, and from his POV, he sees a handful of doors standing in the middle of nature. These were 3D elements that had to be tracked and comped in. Now I was trying to get another visual effects shot where we're standing outside the door looking back at Jarrett, and we see Jarrett inside the house, we see into the house, we see the doorway, but then we see nothing else around the doorway and just see nature around the doorway to sell the fact that this door that he came out of was one of those other doors that he saw there. However, I ended up not shooting that or doing that because of a couple things. First of all, it saved money by cutting out one visual effects shot, and secondly, there were some complications. Even with a wide 20mm lens and even turning the camera portrait style, we still didn't have enough room between the door and the wall that's beside my house in order to get the camera far enough away to see the entire door and make it work for the visual effects shot. So I ended up just scrapping it, and it was fine because it saved money and still looked good anyway. The 2 shots with some cool space elements I did myself. This was simply comping in some existing elements and keying out the sky with a mixture of luma key and chroma key for the blue. Then VFX Shot number 6. We're over Jarrett's shoulder and reveal the final door, his destination. This was one of the hardest shots on the post side of things for the motion tracking, but it was just another 3D asset pumped in with motion tracking and only a little bit of roto as the camera passed behind Jarrett. Again, I intentionally shot this in such a way that it would minimize the amount of roto required in order to help minimize the cost of this shot. Alright, so that was my dissection of the short film Blue. Hopefully you really enjoyed the process of how that all worked, how it all came together. Hopefully you learned a few things from this. Maybe you were inspired, and hopefully you have walked away from this with some ideas on how to do things for your own projects a little bit cheaper, less expensively, or to find ways to get creative and resourceful and just make things really, really cool in your own projects with very, very little expense. I really hope that you, I guess, are walking away from this with maybe some sort of new knowledge or inspiration of how you can go and get creative and resourceful and achieve some cool things in your project for very little extra cost, if any at all. Obviously, there is a certain limit to what level of production value you can expect from this small of a project, but I hope that you have been inspired and have seen that you can definitely still create something really good that is, able to win awards, even just by looking at what resources you have available to you and not really spending much extra on top of what you already have. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm Kyle Lawrence. This has been Filmmaking for Noobs. If you liked what you saw, please like, share, and subscribe. Come back next Friday for more.